Venteriochemistry Wing 1 Incident Prologue. Excerpt from Security Officer Sarah Blalock's Personnel Bio and Incident Debriefing, provided by her Human Resources Representative to the U.S. Commission on Geobiological Resources and Public Safety, as a resource in their investigation into the Venteriochemistry Wing 1 incident. Sarah M. Blalock is a former Marine Corps military police officer who served from 2017 to 2021, and is currently employed, 2021-present, by the PBRSCC as an armed security officer at the PBRSCC facility just outside of the town of Gumption, Texas. The lab is responsible for analyzing biological samples from the Immanis colosseus, aka the Permian Basin Superorganism. Currently, Sarah has just been released from a 24-hour precautionary quarantine with a clean bill of health, and is currently on voluntary paid leave and receiving therapy. She is expected to return to work in early to mid-November. Beginning of debriefing, I sat inside the 6 by 8 foot bullet-resistant security booth, casually skimming through the hourly log that consisted of the usual notes about custodial personnel coming to clean offices, or research personnel leaving late or coming in early. As I was skimming, I heard the PA system beep twice, followed by an announcement requesting medical personnel to urgently respond to Venteriochemistry Wing 1, Lab 7. 4 minutes later, I could hear the medical personnel from the infirmary 2 halls down from my booth rushing past me, and down the hall towards the lab with a wheeled stretcher and medical equipment. I picked up the pen and wrote a note for 0800 hours about the medical response and then went back to skimming through the logs. As I skimmed, I came across a note at 0700 hours that read, Dr. Simmons from Venteriochemistry arrived with a biological sample labeled Alpha 01 to be tested by Dr. Kleiner, from Venteriochemistry. As this piqued my interest, I made a mental note to myself to ask Dr. Kleiner about the results of the lab testing during lunch. As a matter of habit, I looked to my left wrist to read my watch, which read 0810 hours, and decided it was time to go investigate what had happened as none of the medical personnel had come back yet. Then I heard the bone-chilling beep 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 of the panic button followed by the sounds of excited voices, and a scuffle before the panic button's hot mic feature shut off. I quickly looked to the CCTV screen to my right, which I had been neglecting to look at till now. When I looked at the portion that held the feed to camera 3, to my horror, I saw the motionless figure of one of the on-site EMTs in a pool of blood near the door. I saw Dr. Simmons and Dr. Kleiner in their once white lab coats, now blood-stained, violently assaulting the other EMT, who was desperately fending them off with an oxygen tank. As I saw this, I grabbed my radio mic from my shoulder and pressed the transmit button and spoke, break, break, break. Wing 1, Lab 7, Code Violet, Code Violet. 2 combatants. Over. I watched helplessly as Dr. Simmons and Dr. Kleiner forced the EMT away from the door and towards the wheeled stretcher. When the EMT had his back against the wheeled stretcher where the strapped-down lab assistant who had been previously trying to break free, grabbed a hold of him. The EMT couldn't break free before Dr. Simmons and Dr. Kleiner tackled him, flipping the wheeled stretcher in the process. The EMT's former coworkers tore into him, causing me to look away from the footage. I looked at another CCTV camera feed and saw Security Officer Guthrie with his handgun in his left hand, while he was using his right to hold the transmit button on his shoulder mic down while he was speaking. I heard him respond with 10-4, I'm about to reach the door to Lab 7. On the CCTV camera feed in the hallway facing the lab door, I saw him stop by the door, quickly peek in and then enter the room. I saw him on the lab CCTV camera feed, quickly checking his corners before quickly moving to a position where he could get a clear shot on the assailants. Once Officer Guthrie got to within 10 feet of them, he moved to a shooting stance and seemed to be ordering them to stop. The only thing this did was cause the attackers to turn toward him, stand up and begin a quick and off-putting walk towards him. He first aimed center mass at Dr. Simmons, who was leading the pack, and with a moment of hesitation, he fired 3 shots. I heard the echoing pop, pop, pop of the gunshots bouncing off the walls of the hallway. I saw Dr. Simmons slow down some, but he still kept walking towards Officer Guthrie. He fired again, but this time Officer Guthrie must have been aiming to shoot Dr. Simmons in the forehead. As Dr. Simmons crumpled and laid motionless on the tile floor of the lab, Officer Guthrie then began backpedaling to the exit, when the EMT in the pool of blood behind began to stand up without a hint of pain, even though there were several chunks bitten out of him. The bloodied EMT began to make his way toward Officer Guthrie with his arms outstretched. As I saw the bloodied EMT approach Officer Guthrie from behind, I grabbed a hold of my shoulder mic, held down the transmit button and in a calm and collected voice, I spoke, "Break, break, break. Officer JG, the EMT is about to attack you from behind. Over." I saw Officer Guthrie quickly turn and fire a shot at the EMT, who staggered back but regained his balance. I then saw Dr. Kleiner charge at Officer Guthrie from behind, but before I could even begin to transmit a warning, Dr. Kleiner had already grabbed a hold of Officer Guthrie and bit into the back of his neck. As I looked away, I heard several more sporadic gunshots, and then silence. I looked back, I saw Dr. Kleiner continue to attack Officer Guthrie, who lay in a pool of blood on the ground. Knowing that this situation is only going to get worse and that Officer Guthrie was incapacitated, I quickly stood up from the desk. With the coolness of a well-trained professional, I began getting ready. I began a mental countdown timer as I picked up my plate carrier from beside me, pulled it over my head, and secured the Velcro straps, followed by unclipping my slash and flash protective knuckle gloves from my belt and pulling them on. I then grabbed my suppressed M4, which had a red dot optic, from the rack. Before I slung my M4 across my chest, I pulled the charging handle back and chambered around. Before opening the solid armored door of the booth, I grabbed my gray hard hat, which had the PBRSCC security logo stamped on the front. As I left the booth, ensuring to close the door behind me, I made a mental note of 1 minute, 30 seconds. While speedily walking through the hallway, I put on my hard hat, then grabbed my shoulder mic and transmitted, "Break, break, break. This is Officer SB, Venteriochemistry Wing 1. Officer JG is down in Venteriochemistry BSL-1, Lab 7. 3 known assailants. Requesting backup. Over." I heard several 10-4S and en routes, ETAs of 10 to 13 mics, followed by the command center dispatcher responding with a copy that SB, Tactical Response Team, ETA 20 mics. Use of respirator protection is required. Over. I responded with, "Copy that, over and out." I stopped, crouched down, took my hard hat off and set it beside me, and then pulled my Avon M50 mask from its pouch on my leg. I quickly put the M50 to my face, pulled the straps over the back of my head, then rapidly pulled the straps tight and cleared the mask. After doing a mask seal test of the M50, I stood up and put on my hard hat. I began a tactical jog toward the lab. As I drew closer, I heard several excited shouts, then screaming and the sound of glass breaking. I then heard the emergency alarm begin blaring and the panicked opening of doors. As I got even closer, I heard the panicked screams and the pounding of feet. Knowing they would most likely run me down, I stepped into the cubby of a doorway, just as several dozen people streamed past me. I noticed that at least a dozen of them were bleeding from various wounds. As the mass of people began thinning, a blood-covered office worker spotted me and fought his way into my refuge. He spoke with a voice raised just loud enough to be heard over the commotion. He informed me that several of the lab staff and EMTs went crazy and pounded on the door like they were trapped. Once the door was opened, they attacked their coworkers. He also said that there were people still trapped back in storage rooms and labs. I thanked him for the information, and upon noticing he was bleeding from a bite wound on his arm, I pointed him to a first aid kit that hung on the wall across from us. I ordered him to grab it and treat himself and then assist others the best he could when they got outside. Once he and the last of the crowd ran past me, the sounds of their shouts and running were now replaced with the blaring of the alarm and the sound of my breathing that was exaggerated by the M50. I took this as a sign that I should quicken my pace, so I ran a pace run the rest of the way to the corner. As I moved closer to the right turning corner, I slowed to a tactical walk. As I drew closer, I changed the selector switch from safe to semi and brought my rifle to a low-ready position at my left shoulder. After listening for a moment, I could now hear some loud shuffling and groaning. I brought my M4 to my shoulder and tactically peeked around the corner to look down the hallway. I saw Officer Guthrie in his once pristine security uniform, now stained with blood, in a disheveled stance 20 feet away from me, looking down the hallway. I contemplated lowering my rifle and walking up to speak with him, but then I remembered he had been bitten on the back of his neck, and upon looking through the scope of my M4, I realized that he hadn't treated the wound, even though he carried an IFAK. So I quietly moved back around the corner and decided it would be best to approach with extreme caution, as my well-trained gut told me something was off when looking at Officer Guthrie. I tactically moved forward around the corner with my M4 tucked into my left shoulder and stopped 10 feet away from him, and moved into a firing stance. As I took in the carnage of the hallway through the visor of my M50, I saw at least a dozen motionless forms of lab staff and office workers sprawled out in pools of blood on the floor, surrounded by assorted pieces of equipment, shattered glass and scattered documents. As I looked further down the hallway, I realized that there were 9 more of my coworkers in the hallway in the bloodied and ripped lab coats of the lab staff, dress shirts of office workers, and the jumpsuits of custodians and maintenance technicians. I observed how they moved, and something must have caused some neurons to fire, because my brain dug deep to something primal. It felt like an instinctual disquieted feeling that brought a hardwired feeling of aversion and disgust towards something which tried to mimic the human identity. Yet I still fought the urge to open fire and instead spoke out to Officer Guthrie with a voice that sounded nearly inhuman when it was emitted by the M50's voice amplifier. "Guthrie, are you okay?" When he turned to look at me, I realized my gut and brain had been right. I now saw the face of my former colleague. It was almost completely unrecognizable with how badly mangled it was. The only remaining distinguishing feature were his bloodshot bright green eyes. He made direct eye contact with me and I saw the hatred in his eyes. He then let out a raspy and guttural growl, which alerted my former friends and coworkers of my presence. They all responded in kind and began moving towards me with their now emotionless and inhuman movements. As he drew closer, I shook off the shock of what just happened, and a wave of adrenaline flooded through my body and my training took over. I instinctively aimed for his chest and fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. What once was Officer Guthrie let out a guttural groan as it was hit by 3 5.56 rounds, and fell to the ground where it began crawling. I ignored it for now as I took aim at the chest of what once was Dr. Kleiner, who I had just spoken with yesterday while he was with his family at the company's Halloween Eve trunk or treat, but now he only snapped his teeth at me as he sluggishly jogged towards me. I pushed that thought out of my mind and fired 3 rounds into his chest. They all struck home and he fell to the ground where he fruitlessly attempted to crawl towards me. I then adjusted my aim to a young woman in a bloodied and tattered lab coat. I fired 3 rounds into her chest and she fell to the ground where she also attempted to crawl towards me. I moved forward to take position by a tipped-over cart, putting a barrier between me and the thing there once were my coworkers. I kneeled down behind the cart and took aim and repeated the process of firing 3 rounds and adjusting aim to a new target, 7 more times. Which included the maintenance tech, an office worker, the custodian, a lab tech I knew as a close friend whose name was Olivia, both the EMTs and a young biochemistry intern. The charging handle of my M4 locked back after I fired the 30th round and I reloaded my M4 from muscle memory, before standing back up. As the adrenaline began wearing off, I could feel several tears roll down my cheek and collect at the bottom of my M50. I felt a wave of emotions about to wash over me, so to distract myself I listened for noises that might indicate where survivors were. I began slowly moving forward and heard the shattering of glass, then an excited shout, followed by a scream and the sounds of a door slamming, and several fists angrily pounding on a door. I fought the urge to run towards the screams and instead, like a trained professional, picked my way through the carnage, taking care not to get too close to any of the bodies. Once I reached the lab where the screams originated from, I stopped and quickly took a peek around the corner. Seeing the things were distracted, I tactically entered the biochemistry lab, checking the corners and the dead spaces to make sure there would be no surprises. As I moved through the lab I saw it was in a state of disarray, with papers scattered across the floor and overturned stools, broken glass, and drops of blood. I looked to the storage closet in the back right of the room. It had 5 of my former coworkers trying to pound their way through the sturdy wooden door with their fists. I moved slowly and quietly towards the right wall of the lab where I got a clear shot at all of them while not endangering the besieged survivors. I took aim and fired 2 rounds at each of the besiegers' heads in rapid succession. They all went down without protest. Once I determined it was safe to do so, I spoke to frightened lab staff who were hiding in the closet. "I'm Security Officer Sarah Blalock, I'm here to rescue you. If you have any respirators, put them on, otherwise, use whatever you have to protect your airways. I'm also going to move the bodies from in front of the door before you come out. Do you have any rubber gloves out here?" One of them responded saying, "Yes, there's a large pair of chemical-resistant gloves in the drawer to your right." 7 minutes later. I was escorting the 4 biochemists out, who were wearing 3M full-face 6800 respirators when I ran into the first of my backup who had just finished flexi, cuffing the bodies and were now moving down the hall. Before they could ask any questions, I told them what they needed to know. There are more people trapped in the labs down the hall and several more of those things as well, so be careful. They all nodded in agreement and moved past me and the biochemists. When I turned left at the corner and walked down the hall and past my security booth, we were met by several hazmat technicians in Class B suits. They led me and the biochemists to a decontamination station where they had us remove everything but our masks. Everything else became a blur through the rest of the decontamination process, medical examinations, and questions. I later woke up in a medical bed inside one of the on-site quarantine rooms. Everything came back to me and a wave of emotions washed over me as the reality of having to shoot several of my coworkers and friends out of self-defense sunk in. The patient sitter who sat in the left corner of the room wearing a hazmat suit with a hooded PAPR noticed that I had woken up when I began sobbing. The patient sitter stood up and came to my side and began speaking to me. In a compassionate voice, she identified herself. "I'm Dr. Catherine Walker. I'm a therapist who works with law enforcement officers and combat veterans who have been through traumatic events. I'm here to support you and help you process what happened." End of relevant timeline. Epilogue. During the investigation, it was discovered that an expedition team that had recently returned from the Permian Basin Superorganism had brought back a sample of a previously undiscovered biological substance. This unidentified biological substance, dubbed Alpha-01 by the expedition team, was brought in at 7 a.m. on the morning of the incident by Venteriobiologist, Dr. Simmons. He requested that it be urgently identified, which the present Venteriochemist, Dr. Kleiner, obliged. It has been determined by the CGR that the incident was caused out of complacency to procedure and negligence, in order to save time on the part of Venteriochemistry staff and the attending Venteriobiologist. This was discovered when investigators inspected the lab logs, along with inspecting the labeling on the container holding the Alpha-01. It had not been properly labeled as requiring biosafety level 3 precautions due to the unknown health risk, but rather as BSL-1. This allowed for Dr. Simmons, Dr. Kleiner, and an interning lab assistant to be exposed to the altering effects of Alpha-01 without proper PPE or safety equipment in place. This resulted in the following incident as detailed above from the debriefing of Security Officer Sarah Blalock. Her account of the incident has been verified by several survivors, CCTV footage, and her body armor cam. The current casualty count of the Venteriochemistry Wing 1 incident is 29 fatalities and 47 injuries. There have been several reports coming from the Gumption Regional Medical Center indicating that multiple individuals injured in the Wing 1 incidents have become violent. These individuals had to be restrained and in some cases put into a medically induced coma.